Good afternoon, people. Welcome to another episode of Eden House Live. As promised, we always bring you topics that are close to your heart, and we've talked about screen time and digital literacy in the past. We've also talked about temper tantrums and behavior guidance. Today, we will be talking about teenage health and well-being, and that's a topic that's very close to my heart, having a teenager at home. So before we get started, just a few reminders. If you'd like to follow us on Facebook Live, do like our page on Facebook, as well as click interested in our upcoming events. You could also subscribe to our blog and to our newsletter, and I promise you it's a treasure trove of anything parenting, so it's incredible stuff out there. And last but not the least, do send us your questions while we are having a conversation with Dr. Forrest. And if there aren't any questions, just a hello or a hi, just to say that you're there. So let's dive straight into it. Dr. Forrest, thank you so much for being here with us. Dr. Forrest is from the International Medical Clinic at the Camden Medical Center.
Yep.
And I was there for one of his talks, by the way. It was completely sold out. So terribly excited to have him here today, all to ourselves, and all the questions that we will have. So Dr. Forrest, diving straight into the topic of how to support your one's teenage son or daughter as they navigate through this very challenging and transformational journey. Let's get to the core of it to understand what really is happening in the teenage body and mind. What are some of the physiological and the psychological, as well as the physical changes that are taking place?
Sure. Well, if we start with the psychological and mental side of things, the reason that teenagers might behave differently to adults is because their brains are fundamentally different. The brain is remodeling itself and developing up until around the mid-20s. And so teenagers are making decisions and using different parts of their brain to interpret their behaviors. Essentially, the teenage brain remodels from front to back. So the front of the brain is the last bit to remodel.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's where a lot of adult decision making goes on.
Yes,
so the prefrontal cortex is the bit of our brain that allows us to weigh information, think about the future implications maybe of our decisions, and to really plan decisions out. And that's the bit that sometimes teenagers are lacking in a little bit. Teenagers are far more likely to rely on the amygdala, another part of the brain, to help make them make decisions, and that's the bit of the brain that's more impulsive, more instinctive, and makes decisions more based on emotion. So we still have that as adults, but it's sort of modulated a little bit by the frontal parts of the brain, and teenagers develop that at different rates and in different ways. So that's why if you have a teenager, you may see them making very mature decisions on the one hand in certain areas of their life, and more immature decisions on the other hand, and sometimes where we need to help them is to be a little bit more reflective and a little bit less instinctive in their decision making, because they don't always think about the long-term consequences of what they're doing.
Okay, so it's all grounded in science then.
It is, yeah, it is.
Brilliant.
and it's important to say that that's completely normal. So when we talk about teenage mental health and teenage behaviors, it's important to recognize what normal teenagers are like. They are more impulsive, they are more emotional, they will want to spend more time on their own or with friends than with family than maybe when they were younger kids. They may prefer more isolated activities and to shut themselves in their room and listen to music. They will sleep for longer.
I wonder why though. Is there again a scientific?
Again, there's a scientific reason for it. So the hormones like melatonin that govern when we want to go to sleep and when we want to wake up are secreted in the body in a pulsatile way, so at certain times. And that's shifted slightly in teenagers because they're growing, and most of our growth happens at night. And so they generally want to go to bed later, but they also want to sleep in later. I think any parent of a teenager will recognize that.
I know that. And it's hard, isn't it, in the morning getting up and going to school, and it's kind of builds a sort of cycle of fatigue where they're waking up when they haven't slept very long and then can't sleep till very late at night, and that kind of keeps feeding into their bodies and making them more and more tired.
Absolutely. And there are schools around the world that are experimenting with later start times for adolescents,
incredible, yes.
which does make sense, but fitting that into parents' life and general day-to-day life is a challenge.
Yeah.
However you manage it, it's important that they are getting enough sleep, and they do need more sleep than adults. Most teenagers will need 8 hours, some up to 10 hours sleep a night to feel refreshed and to remain healthy.
Right, and it's a bit of a dichotomy, isn't it, where they want to fit in and yet they want to be themselves. They want to assert their individuality. And so again, it's all coming from that physiological, the biological, the mental changes that are happening in their brains.
Yeah, it is, but then there are the sort of social and cultural things going on where you're becoming your own person, as you say, rather than a child, and discovering your own identity and trying to fit in with your peers. And so that's always been a challenge for teenagers anywhere in the world. I think if you add in for kids living in Singapore, the challenges of maybe not having wider family around if they're expat kids. There are other challenges that go with that. And it's important to recognise that all that stuff is normal. So when we talk about mental health issues, all this stuff is fine. Teenagers a bit moody, or wants to spend a bit much time on their own. That's not a mental health problem. That is being a teenager, and if you understand that and can be supportive of that, then sometimes that's all that's required.
So what are these mental health issues?
So I would say, something becomes a mental health issue when it really starts impairing your child's ability to function, whether that's at school, at home, socially. If you feel that it's damaging them in some way, then we've probably tipped over from just normal teenage behaviours to possibly mental health issues. The commonest, as it is in adults, is anxiety and depression, and the two are interlinked. Lots of people feel anxious at times, and that's a normal emotion, as it is for teenagers. But when that starts to impact on your happiness, well-being, if it becomes very frequent, or if it develops into panic attacks, then it's a problem that should be addressed.
Right. And are there any signs that parents should look out for?
Yeah, so anxiety and depression are interlinked because it's very difficult to feel anxious all the time and not start to feel low in mood about that. And so children that appear to be excessively sad, who don't want to come out of their room, who don't want to spend time with family or friends, those would all be warning signs for depression and anxiety. At the more extreme end of the spectrum, and something that's more common in adolescence is self-harm behaviours. That can be more difficult sometimes for parents to pick up on, but looking out for the physical signs of that are important as well.
And when should you seek professional help?
I think we're all different as parents, and people might feel more or less comfortable addressing that with their own child, and your own relationship with your child will affect that. So I think if you feel that it's a problem that's impacting your child and you're not sure how to deal with it, or you've tried and you don't think you're getting anywhere, or you just want another opinion, another take from a third party, that's when seeing your GP can be useful, either by yourself, with the child on their own, or a combination of the two.
Okay, so you're saying perhaps if that's where you want to go, where you need to seek professional help, seek out a GP first?
That's often people's first port of call, even if we're referring people on to therapists or to psychiatrists or whatever might be necessary. Normally either the school, if they have a counsellor or someone who looks after that area, or the GP are a good place to start. And often teenagers like the confidentiality of seeing a doctor, the idea that they can talk to the doctor and it's no one's going to tell their friends or no one's going to tell their school if they don't want them to. That can help them talk about this stuff.
Right, and the fact you talked about, same problems being faced by teenagers all over the world. I guess even us as teenagers, when we were growing up, I was a teenager in the last century. That was like, I think it's really ancient. But we had problems too. We
Yeah.
were also discovering ourselves and going through these same transformations, but we didn't have a very important element of development that we have today, which is social media,
Yeah.
which is pretty much ubiquitous. So what and how does social media impact the mental health of teenagers?
So you're absolutely right. It is a big factor, and our teenagers fundamentally are facing the same issues that we did. The problem with social media is that it makes the whole thing more 24/7.
Right.
So in days gone by, if you were being bullied at school or you feel like you didn't have many friends, then you could come home at the end of the day and that bit of your life was separated.
Over, yeah.
Now on social media, if you're being bullied, you're probably being bullied on social media as well. If you're worried about friendships, that's being perpetuated on social media. If you're worried about your body image, that's being perpetuated. And so it acts as an amplifier. I don't think social media is the root cause of any of these problems, but it amplifies them and it makes them more difficult to deal with for teenagers.
And moving on to the sort of parenting strategies, where does parenting, what are some of the boundaries that parents should set? I know every parenting style is different, and there's no good or bad parent. It's really what works for you and your context and your family. But when does a parent stop being a friend and more of a parent? I mean, where do you have? It's very hard. We're constantly juggling and understanding our interactions with our children, and understanding what part the good cop today, the bad cop today, the parent today, the friend today, tomorrow. So what are your thoughts around that?
I think you're right, it's difficult, and every parent has a different take on where those boundaries lie. I think the two most important things for parents to think about is the first is setting an example. So you can teach your child simply through modeling good behaviors and managing your own mental and physical health and well-being, and your behavior towards other people as an example to your children. So even outside of your relationship, just what they see of you is important. And then the other one is just being there. I think it's much healthier if your children feel that they're able to talk to you. There's always going to be things that teenagers are embarrassed to talk to their parents about, and that's not the fault of the parents. But the idea of being there and being present and being open to hear their problems and not sort of playing down their problems, because their problems, even if we think they're trivial, to them they're the biggest thing in the world. And saying, oh well, everyone feels a bit anxious or everyone feels a bit down in the dumps at times, probably isn't helpful. I think it's useful to acknowledge the importance of the issue to them. And so you can achieve an awful lot just by being present and being available for your children. I think, as we mentioned, if it gets to the point where you're a little bit out of your comfort zone and a little bit out of your depth, then maybe that's when it's time to ask for help, whether that's professionally through a GP or through friends, relatives, etc.
Talking about uncomfortable conversations, is there a right or wrong time for that? And should you do it sooner than later? So, for example, sexual orientation or changes in the body, or when should you do it?
I mean, I'm a firm believer that sooner is better than later. Again, it's for every parent to make their own call, and there are strong feelings about when those conversations are appropriate. But we know that all the research shows that children are having these conversations at school or online already at a worryingly young age. And so waiting till your child's 14 or 15 to have a conversation about sex or alcohol or whatever it might be, it's too late. They're going to have learned from the places you don't want them to learn from, their friends and the internet. And so I think the key is to be in control of that conversation and to be in charge of the narrative from a younger age, even though that might make you as the parent feel a bit more uncomfortable.
And in terms of when they start adolescence or these changes start to happen, is it different for girls and boys, or is it similar?
It's framed in different ways. The ages are different, so girls tend to start puberty from a younger age than boys. That's just a natural thing. Only on average by a year. And so most of these things are running in tandem, but as we will see from our own kids, the levels of physical development within a class can be quite varied,
Right.
and it would follow that the levels of emotional and mental development are quite different as well.
Right. Yeah. Coming to talking about physical development, so obviously height and weight, those are some of the changes that are happening. So how can parents really support this phase in their children's lives in terms of the appropriate and the right kind of nutrition or exercise or sleep? What are some of the suggestions that you might have for our parents?
So again, following on from what we said earlier, modeling good behavior. So children will learn about diet and exercise and things like that from what they see at home, and ultimately you are still in charge of what your child eats and what physical activity they do. So setting good boundaries and behaviors there is important. Being sympathetic and understanding of the physical changes they're going through, which are mainly hormonally regulated, and those obviously are very different between girls and boys. So from breast development to period starting can be a very difficult time for some girls. Hair growing in places that it hasn't grown before, and the awkwardness that goes with that, particularly because they may be a very early developer in their class, they may be a very late, and both of those things can have stigma attached to them.
Yeah. My son came back when he went back to school after the summer, and he says to me, "Mum, my friends have really grown in the last 8 weeks, and some of them are much taller than me now, and I'm way shorter." And therefore there was this, what can I do?
Yes.
What should I do? So I said the first thing they need to do is sleep. I think that's one of the areas in which teenagers don't get enough, and that impedes with their growth. Is that
right? Yeah.
And protein and calcium, that's something that I believe is an important component of the children's diet.
So a healthy balanced diet's important. Growing your bones and growing your body tissues demands a lot of energy. It's a high calorie activity for the body, and so eating enough is important, and eating the right kinds of food. We know that dietary habits that are set in adolescence tend to follow people through their lives, and so whilst some kids might be able to get away with eating a lot of junk and processed food without necessarily gaining weight, you're setting them up for problems down the line. And so eating a balanced, healthy diet in adolescence is just as important, if not more, than it is for adults. They need a lot of physical activity. Ideally, they should be doing something physically active on most days of the week. And again, we know that recent research suggests they're spending more time in front of computers, more time living a sedentary lifestyle, and that's not great.
Right. So do you recommend a certain number of, like an hour or 2 hours of physical exercise every day, or?
Half an hour to an hour a day would be ideal. Obviously, a lot of kids will get that through school anyway, one would hope. And it doesn't really matter what it is. It has to be something that they enjoy, otherwise they won't keep doing it. If you're having to force them out the house to do something, that's never going to last.
Right.
And so it can be anything, but trying to find something physical that they enjoy is important.
And are there any vaccinations that teenagers should access?
There are some routine vaccinations that are given through the teenage years, although much fewer than are given in early childhood. Under most national schedules, you have a tetanus booster somewhere between 10 and 14 years old, and in many countries we give the HPV vaccine at the same time as that. So HPV vaccinates for a virus that's implicated in cervical cancer in women. It's on the national schedules in most European, North American and Australasian countries, and it's one that we recommend, and it's often convenient to give it at the same time as that tetanus booster.
And talking about physical development again, are there any problems that teenagers tend to face during their growth spurt or during that?
So there are some problems, sort of physical musculoskeletal problems that are related to growing bones. I see a lot of kids with knee, ankle, hip pain related to growing, and often that doesn't need any treatment, but sometimes parents want some advice and reassurance on that. There are the changes that go with the hormonal changes of puberty. So acne is a common problem in adolescence, can be quite distressing and have a significant impact on people's lives. Problems around periods for girls, if they're very heavy or very erratic, trying to manage those. And then, although a lot of parents don't like to think about it, the health implications of becoming sexually active and sexually transmitted infections and that sort of thing. Those are I suppose, the key things that are different with adolescence. Of course, we still see infections and coughs and colds and all the usual stuff as well.
Right. Well, one of the conversations that we have very often at the dinner table in my family is about height and how tall will our son be.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I don't know, I've read where you can actually predict the height of your child, and is there any scientific basis to that, or when do children actually, boys or girls, when do they reach their final height? Do you have any
So
stats
it
to
happens
share
at
on
different ages. Most children achieve a height somewhere between mum and dad.
Yeah.
So you can predict it in that way. If you have some measurements and you plot it on a growth chart, we can give a reasonably accurate prediction of final height, although it's not. It's based on population, so it's not perfect. And girls achieve their final height at a younger age than boys. So girls around 16, boys probably around 18.
Right.
There's still a little bit of growth happening there. It is a I'm always surprised at how big a deal it is to parents and children to think about this.
Especially if your son wants to play basketball.
Well, this is a factor, and so you can give some useful information there. In extreme cases, if we're worried about growth hormone deficiency or children that really aren't growing appropriately, we can identify that and aim to treat it before the growth plates in the bone start to fuse. You can actually give some treatment to help boost growth, but fortunately that's very seldom needed, and often parents and children just need reassurance that, like your son, just because some friends may have hit their growth spurt a little bit before him, they're going to catch up and it will all even out in the end.
Right, and it's pretty much dependent on your genes, isn't it? You can't fight that.
No, you can't, no. And very much dependent on your parents' height, although we often see kids that are taller than their parents. You know, very tall parents will tend to have tall children on average, and very short parents will have shorter children.
So blame it on your parents.
Absolutely.
Are there any tools and resources that you would, suggest to parents to access on a daily basis in terms of perhaps Camden Medical? Do they have a resource library or newsletters?
We have a website and we have publications and talks like this which are available. There's of course the option of coming in to discuss with us if it's something more important. There's also some very good websites around the world for these things. Websites like Headspace, Are You Okay?
Yeah.
Ask Sigmund. I don't know if we can put those on online.
We can perhaps collate all this information and make it available on.
Quite useful guides on the mental health side of things, because that's often where parents, I think, need help. And if you're worried about acne, it's very easy to Google that and read about the symptoms and the treatments. For some of the mental health issues, it can be a bit more of a minefield online, so it's useful to have sort of reliable resources to look at for that.
And are there any specific support services available at Camden that you want that are over and above what you just said?
Yeah, absolutely. So whilst we might be the first port of call to discuss, we work alongside and with therapists, counsellors, school nurses and school counsellors, psychiatrists and paediatricians as required to meet the individual needs of the patient. Sometimes parents book in to see me just to have that conversation, so the child isn't present. They might say that this is my concern. Am I worrying unnecessarily, or should we move on from this? And then we might get the teenager in to sit down and have a chat. And often, if the parents are okay with it, getting the child in on their own without sort of mum or dad sitting behind their shoulder can be helpful for them to really sort of express how they're feeling and tell you what's going on.
Right. Well, you're a parent and you have younger children, so I'm sure some of the parents listening in today also have a lot of younger children, because Eden House we do have preschools and young families. So what is some of the strategies or some of the suggestions you'd like to share with them in order to help them navigate and transition through this phase of life which they have to, and emerge stronger at the end of the day, at the end of the tunnel?
I think being realistic about what a young child is important. So we all want to, my kids are 5 and 3, if I could bottle them and preserve them like this with their innocence for the rest of their lives, that would be great, but we can't. And so, as I mentioned, you need to take the lead on that. And so a lot of 10-year-olds are surprisingly mature and able to have a mature conversation, and it's much better for them to have that with you than with some other kid in the playground. I think being in control of what they read and what they see, particularly online, in younger kids, is important. With teenagers, it's more of a challenge because you've got to allow them a little bit of freedom. But in younger kids, really, you should be in 100% control of their screen time and what they're able to watch. And again, to set good behaviours. If you're a respectful, sensible, loving parent, then you would hope that they would turn into respectable, sensible, loving children as well.
Absolutely. Well, famous last words. Thank you so much for joining us
problem.
today.
Thanks for
If you found this information useful, we will collate all of this and put it together on our blog. And if you want to follow us for future Facebook Live events, do like us on Facebook or click interested in the upcoming events section. On that note, thank you very much once again, and I will see you when I see you. Have a lovely afternoon and cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.